Welcome to lecture number 32 on the Kuzari. We are in the middle of Ma'amar Shlishi, that is the third essay, paragraph Chaf Gimel, that is paragraph 23. In this version, the Rabbi Korobkin version of the Kuzari that I am using, it would be on page 316. And last time we studied together the beginning of the Chaver's response, the rabbi's response to the king's question regarding our response to the Karaite Jews. Now, just to oversimplify greatly, but the general debate between the Karaite Jews, the primary difference is that the Karaites believe that rabbinic Jews, that the rabbis corrupted their understanding of the Torah, and that they made up all kinds of things to interpret the verses of the Torah, so that when we keep the Torah as rabbinic Jews, right, we're not keeping the Torah as it was meant to be. A lot of the verses in the Torah we're not fulfilling the way they're written, but we're fulfilling it based on this what we call the oral Torah or the tradition, etc., which they think is made up by human beings. So they stick to the literal meaning of the verses as much as possible, as directly as possible. Now, the rabbinic Jews respond that the Torah was given to us as in its written form, at Sinai, and God also gave us the tools with which to interpret it. Right? He told us how to read it and and to some extent that means like the Yud Gimel Midos, the 13 ways that we can expound on the Torah and compare and contrast and so on in order to learn one thing from another. And to some degree, these were ideas, mitzvot, or ideas about mitzvot, or details as to exactly how to fulfill the commandments. And just so this is the debate, and the Karaites, and forgive me if I don't have it exact, but they became a really big deal in like the 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th centuries, and continued to be significant communities to many hundreds of years afterwards. And I did say that they do still exist, although they're a much smaller in number and less well known as what nowadays we would call mainstream Judaism. So mainstream Judaism became the Rabbinite Jews, or the rabbinic Jews, the ones that we're familiar with today. But so that's the debate. Now, famously, Rabbi wait, I'm sorry, Rabbi Sadia Gaon. I'm sorry, it slipped my mind. Sadia Gaon, who lived, I think, in the 9th or 10th century in Babylon, he was very and in Iraq. He was very influential in fighting the Karaites and debating them and disproving them and so on in the polemics that were between the two groups. Each one, of course, claiming that they represented the true Judaism. Now, the one thing that we should know is that and this is me talking now, and that is that when we have any text, on the one hand, the Karaite view seems to be a pretty a pretty convincing view. Like, the words say this. Shouldn't we be more focused? If the Torah is given to us by God, if it is, the word for word from God, so we should be focused on the meaning of those words. We should focus on the actual meaning and fulfill the Torah as it is written. The problem is that we can't. You and I, and we all know that any text that we study and read and learn together is always going to have different interpretations, and there's always going to be meanings that are unclear. There's always going to be things that it's unclear. So if you try to do a literalist interpretation of the Torah, you're still going to be asking yourself, okay, so how do I do this? So the Torah says you should hang fringes, right, on your garment. Well, what does that mean? How many? What color should they be? How do I tie them on the garment? Which garment needs it? So on and so forth. there's going to be questions. So it almost begs for some form of interpretation. So how do we do that? How does that happen? That's so just keep that in mind. But the Kuzari here is going to go on a much more roundabout answer. So let's give him time to get there to his argument with the Karaites. So I'm up to the Hebrew words v'haya samuch lahashlamaso chol hashchina, and just to remind you what he had just stated in his answer. So he asked him about the Karaites, and the Chaver answered him. He's giving some introductions. Number one, he said that, and this is a basic Rabbi Yehuda Halevi opinion, which we've come across numerous times until now, and which is in contrast with what we know to be the Rambam's and more rationalist approach. And that is that we don't keep the Torah because it makes sense. We don't keep the Torah because we understand the meaning and purpose of this particular mitzvah. But rather, we keep the Torah because God said so. The mitzvahs that we do are specifically because God told us to do them, right? And he says because, and he started off by saying, if we were to go completely based on our own minds, then we can come up with all sorts of conclusions. Human beings can conclude that there's 10 gods, or human beings have made all kinds of conclusions. So therefore, that's not the way it works. We keep the Torah. Now, remember, this is Rabbi Yehuda Levi's opinion, and this is a very important and well established a school of thought within Judaism, that this is why we keep the mitzvos. And then he brought as an example, he says, as we see when the Mishkan was built, repeatedly when the tabernacle was being built, it kept on saying it was built the way God told Moshe to build it. That's how it was done. So the Rabbi Yehuda Levi brings that as a support to his strongly held position that the Mishkan was done because this is what God said, and this is how God told us to do it. And then we willingly and full of desire and passion did it that way. Soon after it was completed, the Shechina, the divine presence, then rested within the Mishkan. The two things that are required, the two main things that anything in the Torah, for it to be accepted, for it to be done right, has to happen. Number one, it has to be being done because God said so. Now remember, this is an opinion that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is putting forth based on his understanding of Torah and Chazal, right? That a mitzvah is only worthwhile. A mitzvah lishma means, right? A mitzvah done for its sake means doing it because God said so. But if you were to do it because it made sense to you, even if you did the same act, right, it wouldn't be the same. You wouldn't be fulfilling lishma. That is not necessarily the opinion of all Jewish philosophers, but it is very much so the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. I know I made this point a million times, but I'll probably make it a million more times. But number one, Shetia Torah Me'esa Elikim, that we do it, that this particular teaching, this particular law has to be God-given. V'hasheni, and the second one, Shetia Mikubelas Belev Neman Me'akol. The people need to accept it. They need to accept it willingly and desiringly. They want to do it. And then when those two acts are fulfilled, that is an act that's being done properly. So if you do it because God said so, but you're dragging your feet and you wish you were somewhere else and you'd rather be watching TV or you'd rather be going on a cruise, so then okay, that's not the same thing. But if you do it because you want to and you want to serve God and so on, then that act has its full fulfillment. So the Mishkan, the tabernacle, was God's commandment, and it was being done by the entire congregation. All of Israel participated willingly and full of desire. From every single person who had it in his heart to do it. With absolute desire and will. Right? So therefore, it was obvious, it was necessary, it was absolutely the logical next step would be, the automatic step would be that the Shechina would reside, like it says, and my divine presence shall rest among you. right? The or among them actually. Ukvar dimisi lecha b'yitziras hatzemach v'achayim. And I already made you a comparison when it comes to the formation of plants and animals. He's about to go on a tangent, which is part of his building his case, but it's going to be very interesting when it comes to modern science. And it's another place, because we've had several examples where where Rabbi Yehuda Levi was willing to make statements based on his understanding of science, as if this was going to be the be all and end all of science, right? And as we know, it wasn't. And so some of his arguments, obviously not the primary philosophy and arguments and ideas expressed in this book are timeless, but some of the arguments that he presents start holding a little less water in 2026. And this is, you can decide for yourselves if this is going to be one of them, but let's hear what he has to say. Which is why, by the way, I don't think it's a good idea for us to prove God scientifically and say the science says A, B, and C. How there's people that try various versions of this in all different kinds of fields. I don't think it's good, because as our science advances and changes, some of the ideas that you express might in 20 years or 10 years or 200 years might sound kind of antiquated. And if that's how you're proving God, then your whole proof falls apart, right? So it's much better for us to come to our understanding of God through spiritual means, through understanding philosophical ideas, and through our hearts, rather than trying to prove it with the science. Is important, and it's great, and it's the best way for us to understand the world that's around us, and we should study it and learn it, and we should gain from it and be inspired from it and use it for proper purposes, etc. No, in no way will I ever say anything negative about science, and I don't want it to sound that way at all, but not to use science as a proof for God. I think when you do that, you're making a very big mistake. And I know a lot of people have done this and do this and continue to do this, but I think it's a giant mistake.
So,
And you, yes, go ahead.
what number paragraph are you on?
I'm on page 317, and I'm in the middle of 23, paragraph 23, about three paragraph. It's number 4. I have already illustrated is what I'm about to read. I'm giving a little intro to what we're about to read. So in the Korobkin translation, it starts, I have already illustrated for you the formation of plant and animal life. That's what I'm about to read. I've already described to you how God created animals and plants, or plants and animals. And I said, right? That the fact that if you see a plant, right, you see some green stuff, right? What makes this a plant? And why doesn't it walk around and talk to you and say hi, right? Why doesn't it do animal things? Or maybe animals might not say hi, but they walk around and they jump and run or fly or whatever. How come? And here you see a pile of feathers and flesh and bones. Why does that thing fly around, right? Only because because remember, he was going with the Aristotelian idea of Homer and Sura. There's Homer, that's the substance, and Sura is the form that it's the spiritual. It's kind of like, not exactly Aristotelian to say spiritual, but the spiritual essence within that object that makes it into a bird or a tree or whatever, right? So that comes from God. That doesn't come. There's nothing natural about that substance, right? That makes it into a plant, right? The reason why that green stuff is a plant and acts like a plant is because God gave it that spiritual nature to make it a plant instead of an animal, right? And this, the philosophers call it teva. Now, teva is an interesting word, because most of you, if you're familiar with the word, you think of it as teva, meaning nature. Now, it's interesting because we don't find that word in Tanakh, and I'm pretty sure we don't find it in Chazal either. I think it's earlier. Rabbi Yehuda Levi was one of the earliest people using the term, right? But so I don't know. We need a linguist to tell me exactly the origins of the term, but it has become the Hebrew word for nature, and it in Rabbi Levi, and at least Ibn Tibbon, who was the translator, who was only a little bit after, maybe less than a century after Rabbi Levi, was already using it as a term, as a Hebrew term. So in modern Hebrew, obviously teva. Ve'emes hu ki hativaim mizdamnim lekibul hamasa hu kifi erka me'achom v'yakor v'yalachos v'ayovesh. Right? It is true that the elements, the stuff that makes up the green plant or the bird, has to be an exact mix of the four primary elements. Remember, in Aristotelian idea, now we have a whole table of elements, but then they had four elements. Wind, wind, which is air, earth, fire, and water, and the exact right mix. So you have this green thing with leaves on it and a stalk, right? But what makes it grow and reproduce and make flowers and whatever? The tzura that God puts into it. Tamar gefen sus ari, and with the exact right mix, this one looks like a date palm, and this one looks like a grapevine, and this one looks like a horse, and this one looks like a lion. However, we can't quantify them. We don't know exactly how much of each element is necessary to make that mix, right? So if we could, then we could make blood and we could make milk, derech mashal, for example. We can make semen, right? If we were able to get the exact amount of moisture and the exact amount of, remember, he only knew four elements. So until we'd be able to create life, such life that maybe even would have the living spirit in them. Or we could make something that substitutes bread that doesn't come from wheat. Now, just by the way, in modern science, and not everything, we can't yet create life. We can do maybe cloning, which is close, but it's not quite the same thing as creating life. But we're, but who knows if scientists won't announce next week that they've made a living bacterium. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if it happens soon. So I wouldn't rest my argument on this, right? However, but so he's making a point, which certainly would have been true in his time. However, nowadays we can make milk. I mean, if you go to Israel and go to the grocery store and buy Remilk, okay, it's a brand. It's available on the shelves. It's called Remilk. It's chemically exactly the same as milk, right? And they make it out of the ingredient. They broke up the ingredients of milk and they made milk. It's 100%. It's like there's zero difference. You could put it in a lab and test it. You wouldn't know the difference. It's milk, but it doesn't come from a cow. It comes from a factory where they made milk, right? So his examples, and there's no reason to assume that if there was reason to do this, science could develop. Because I don't drink, I don't eat animal products. When I was in Israel, I had, a Remilk a milkshake. It was delicious. It was great. It was like a regular milk. You wouldn't have known the difference. But you can get it at any supermarket. Even in America, you can get it, but it's a little harder to find. But b'sha'arenu hachom v'lachas, if we knew exactly how to mix things. So he's talking about mixing the four. I just turned the page to 318. V'akor v'yovish, how much coldness, how much heat, right? He's using his scientific terminology to say what we, things. But kol shekain imneda ha'arachim hagalgaliyim u'maseim ha'ozrim, if we understood how the celestial bodies had effects. So remember that in their physics, they understood that the planets and the constellations had effects on this world. If we knew how to manipulate those effects, right? Aldas hachozim, according to the astrologers, right? They know a little bit about this. Right? They can, as they claim to be able to understand. So if we were able to manipulate all these forces, we could do all kinds of things. We already seen how what abject failure people who have attempted to do this have come to. I mean, from people that are alchemists, ubale aruchnius, and the spiritualists who try to do all kinds of incantations and make this happen. So so the bottom line is that we can't do it. It's impossible, right? He's making a statement that I don't know if it's going to hold up to science, over time. Already, some of the statements that he made specifically have already been proven to be wrong, which is why I don't think his approach is a good one. And far be it for me to criticize Rabbi Levi, but I just think it's a mistake. It's a mistake to do this, because it's not a criticism of him. He had no reason to believe that science would have advanced. It's not something that people understood back then. So, but regardless, that some people have learned how to create living creatures, so that they manage to get bees come from flesh of cows, or get bugs like flies coming from wine. They experimented. They realized that if you leave a bottle of wine out, eventually there's going to be flies in it. So they learned how to manipulate the situation to leave out wine and get flies. So it looks like they're creating life, but they're not actually creating flies, right? It's just like, how did people discover over time that when you have sex, eventually someone gets pregnant and has a baby? You figure it out, and then it happens. You didn't create a baby. You just learned that this and this act leads to this and this result. Right? In these cases, it's no more than just planting a seed in the ground. If you take a tomato seed and you put it in the ground, it grows a tomato. So that's what happens. We learn that it's nothing miraculous about it. Right? But the exact combinations that are necessary, the exact elements that are necessary to mix that can create a human being, only God has such things. The same thing, the ingredients that are necessary for the special nation that which is worthy of having within it reside that special spiritual essence. That's again a major part of Rabbi Levi's philosophy, that there's a special actual physical essence, a spiritual essence that makes the Jewish nation different. Remember, we talked about that. That's controversial, but again, that's an idea that comes up over and over again in Rabbi Levi's thought. Only God has that. The only way we know how to nurture that and bring about that special spirit is to hear from God. How do you do it? And obviously, God told us how to do it in the Torah. A person shouldn't be smart by himself. Say, right? You can't be smart and you can't be wise when it comes to opposite God. It doesn't work that way. God. So the bottom line of what his argument is, I think, remains valid. The bottom line is that in order to understand how God wants us to live in this world, in order to understand how to keep the Torah and how to live properly, we get those instructions from God, right, through the Torah. And we're going to talk soon. Remember, he's laying the foundation for his argument that the interpretation of the Torah is also something that we get from God. His proof, which he used scientific proof, I think is with much trepidation and much humility, I think it's a mistake to give such proofs, because who's to say that in a few years' time, or maybe in a few months' time, a scientist won't be able to, imagine if we had an incubator that you can incubate a human being, and it would be extremely complicated, and it's beyond our capabilities now. But to imagine that one day there won't be science that can do that, I mean, maybe there will be such science that can do that, and then we already learned cloning. We learned how to put how to develop an embryo. So who knows? But anyway, so I don't think it was necessary for him to give that argument. But regardless, that's what he says. Now I'm about to end paragraph 23. So therefore, what do you think is the best way for us to follow their footsteps, the footsteps of our forefathers, right? And not decide on our own how to keep the Torah, right? What would be the best way, right? So I just told you that the only way for us to accomplish and achieve what God wants in this world is to do what God wants, because he tells us he's the only one. He's the only source of knowledge for us to know how to live, right? He gave us the Torah, but how should we move forward? How do we go about achieving that? We want to do it. We have the desire to do it, right? What do you think is the best idea? So Amar Kuzari. So the Chazar king answers, and this is really Rabbi Yehuda Levi talking, right? And he's saying, right, that Yefshar lazeh ela b'hatokas divrayim v'semach masayim, right? The only way to do that is to is number one, record what it is that God wants from us, so that it can be taught to generations, and we can look it up in a book if we need to, right? And to model after the people that we saw, for each parent, each teacher to teach their student or their child, this is how it's done, right? How else would we know what God wants from us if we're not prophets? And we already talked about prophecy many times, which we don't have access to. So how else are we going to know, right? That's the only way. Right? If we find someone, right, who believes this, right? In other words, someone who believes and wants to pass it on, from one group of people to another. In other words, it's not just one guy passing on a secret to one guy, because those are highly suspect. But and also it's like a game of telephone; it keeps changing and changing. But if it's an entire group of people passing it on to an entire group of people, right? Because when you have a lot of people, everyone can say, I know, we all know. And if someone says, hey, you're doing it not like they used to do it, and then it's, oh yeah, you're right, because there's a collective memory that's a lot more reliable than a person to person memory. Modern psychology, social psychology may not agree with this idea either, but you can imagine there is some truth to this, right? Nowadays, especially, if someone wants to make up what and say, oh, 10 years ago this and this happened, well, I can look it up on the internet and I can tell you what really happened 10 years ago. There's a collective memory that's better than individual memory. Right? So that it's unlikely that a whole lot of people can all get together and have a mass delusion, right? That such and such did or didn't happen. Unfortunately, there are things within our memory that there's mass delusions about, despite plenty of evidence. You'll have people argue over what really happened on a certain day, and one camp will tell you this is what really happened. The other camp will tell you that's what really happened. And God knows half the time they're both wrong. But anyway, the idea here is that a mass of people will all these people, right? It can't be that they're going to have this mass delusion on the idea that we accepted the Torah from God, and the results and all of the details, and its explanations, Mimoshe, Berura, that was clear, Balavavos Basfarim, either in written form or in passed on form in our hearts, in our collective memory. And we do know from history many cases of collective memory, of oral traditions that have been proven over time to be extremely, extremely accurate and valuable traditions as to real history. We find this, in oral histories of many societies that have kept for hundreds and hundreds, in some cases thousands of years, memories of historical events that are passed on that turn out to be, either through archaeological or geological evidence, turn out to be the truth. This is a mistake of the early anthropologists, that when they met a tribe on an island somewhere and they would ask them their history and they would tell them this whole story, they would assume it was a myth. But over time, we've learned that you shouldn't think it's a myth. There's some truth in that story that might actually give you some ideas as to what really happened. And this is what happened. That's what I would imagine, says the Chazar King. That's how the Torah should be passed on. So Amar Chaver, but what happens if there's some sort of discrepancy? What if I write a book and then my kids write books, and then their kids write books, and then their kids write books, and before you know it, there's 50,000 people writing books, and it's pretty clear that every one of the books isn't going to be exactly the same. He's going to write this, he's going to write that, and before you know it, there's going to be 5 different versions of how much you're supposed to eat matzah on Pesach. There's going to be, some say it's supposed to be hard matzah, some say it's supposed to be soft matzah, some say it's this big, some say it's that big. There's going to be different versions, right? What are you going to do? So Amar Kuzari, so the Chazar King said, Ya'ainu berov asram, we would look at all of them. And if we analyze the books and everything, we can trace what's the more legitimate version. Because in general, when you see it in the majority, that must be the truth, because the lie wouldn't be so prevalent. And the one or two that seem to be going off the path, right? We should leave them out, because that's clearly not the right one. That's clearly the mistaken version. If 10 versions of a manuscript say X and one of them says Y, the Y one is probably wrong. And the same thing when this is what happens when people copy books. Remember, this is before the printing press. So a book was copied. There would be a manuscript sent out, and people would sit and write copies, 1 copy, 2 copies, 3 copies. So when there's a minority that copied it a little differently, they look at the majority, how you spell this word, and they get it right that way. So Omar HaChaver, so says the Chaver, Umat Omar Ba'os Shetimotzei Basforim, right? Bechiluf HaHakasha. What if you find, right, a letter, a specific letter in the books that just seems to be illogical? It seems to just not be right. Right, which literally means they captured our footsteps. Hatira shehu tsaru, right? Would you think that it must be logically? What does it mean? They captured our footsteps. What does that mean? But we know the Dalet and the Resh look similar. Tsaru tsuadenu means they tightened and they squeezed. They let a makom tsar is a place where you get squeezed and squished. Right? They squeezed our footsteps. Right? That makes sense. That's a sentence that makes sense. Asher lo nasal ashav nafshi. Right? Which means that he did not carry lashav nafshi, for falseness my soul. Right? Yeshivu nafsho. It must be his soul. And there's many cases like this where logic would dictate that probably the word meant something else. And especially when the letters are similar, you can imagine such a mistake where you would change it back. So what would you do in those kinds of cases? So Amar Kuzari, im tishlot ha'akasha aleila v'adom alehem, right? If you would use reason to change all of these spellings, right, for example, and it would be just reason, right, and it would be just logic, so then over time, Tishanas Ram Kulam, everyone would be changing the books. They would all be changing the letters to something that makes more sense. And over time, first they would change letters, eventually they would change words, and eventually they would change entire paragraphs, entire topics. They would change the vowels. And then they would change the tamim is the trup, the cantillation marks. Eventually the whole meaning of the book would change. Right? Right? There are so many ways you can reverse the meaning of an entire verse simply by changing words. So you understand how he's setting him up to understand why his argument for the fact that there is a tradition in how to interpret the Torah. So, but we're getting there. So Amar Chaver, so the Chaver says, V'ech tachshov sheiniach Moshe Torah b'nei Yisrael. How do you think the Torah scroll, the specific Torah that Moshe left and wrote and gave to us, the first Torah, the original one? So the Kuzari answers in 30, in paragraph 30, Mibli Safek Shaya Sefer Pashat. It must have been extremely simple. Me'ein nikud v'ta'amim, right? It would have been without all of the things that are later additions, right? Which are the vowels and everyone knows those are later additions. Historically, we know, right, that those are not things which were given, or were in Moshe's Torah. Those are things that came much later on. The same way we see a Torah today, right? Because it would have been impossible, right, for everyone to agree. There would have been arguments. Is it, you pronounce it who, he, hi? How do you pronounce it? So, but if it's written in simple, basic letters, just like everyone, it would be impossible for everyone to all of a sudden agree that we're going to eat matzah on Pesach, right? Or everyone to agree to any one of the mitzvos in the Torah. These things which help bring into our hearts the hearts of the people of Israel, the truth of the Exodus from Egypt, with these constant repeated acts that we do every year. Right? If somebody would just at one point say, oh, let's start eating a cracker, right? Somebody would say, no, we shouldn't eat a cracker, we should eat the pizza. It would be some kind of argument. So Amar Chaver, so the Chaver says, Mibli Safek, Shaya Shomer Balavavos, Bapatcha, Vahakometz, Vahashever, Vahanatia, Vahashav, Vatzamim. There is no doubt, right, that people preserved, even though the Torah was given in the letters that it was given with, there's no doubt that the way to read it with the vowels was something that people kept by tradition. The Kohanim, whose job it was to teach, whose job it was to worship and serve God in the temple, they had to know how to read it, right? And in the kings, who are the leaders, right? They were commanded. They were commanded to read the Torah. And the judges, they needed to know the laws of the Torah. Sanhedrin and the leading court, the Sanhedrin, because it says that their job was to keep and do. This is your special wisdom, your special understanding. And those who were pious, the people who studied Torah because they were pious people, in order to be rewarded for their good deeds. Are the people, even the people who study simply for the sake of honor, in order to be great. So a lot of people are studying Torah, and all of these people must have known how to read it. The Samu Shivas HaMelachim V'Ta'amim also Sotchunos Ahem. The Shivas HaMelachim refers to, literally translates to the 7 kings. It's referring to 7 grammatical rules, right? Which we accepted from Moshe. Right? And what do you think about all those people who remember the psukim, where you end each verse, right? What about all the people who did that, who made the verses, and then put the vowels in, and then they put the cantillation marks in, which is really like a punctuation, right? The traditions that we have, and when you write a word complete, and when you're with a certain letter or without a certain letter, until the point where they were able to count specifically a specific number of letters, and they figured out that the vav in the word of gachon in Sefer Vayikra is halfway. Ushmiras kol nachri mikomatzu patach v'tzeri v'segel yotzim min hakasha. And they made sure to preserve every word, and so on. Do you think this was for no purpose? Or do you think it's important? Right. So the Chazar King says in 32, Aval hishtadlos b'dvar chova, right? No, so for sure, this was something that was very important. It was necessary. Im shmiras Torah, together with keeping the Torah, shlo yeh derech l'shanosa, so that if you didn't keep the Torah, then no one would know how to keep the Torah in the next generation. Im hachachma muvla ki nira mikvios hanikud v'tamim seder shlo yeh ela mechachma nezeret. Because all of this could only have been done, right? How could they have all done this together? This must have been done with some sort of a tradition backing it up, something that came from God when the Torah was given that taught them how to do this. It couldn't have just happened, right? And it couldn't have just been human wisdom alone that made these decisions. And it wouldn't be that the public would accept it. Ella meirabim ritzuyim, only if it was from a group of people that everyone had accepted. Why would everyone accept it if it was just a group of scholars in the ivory tower? Rather, it must be they accepted it because they knew and trusted that these people were doing what God wanted them to do. The only way people would accept from a specific person is if that person was an established prophet or had some other reason why they would believe a specific person. But in general, one guy who gets up and tells everybody how to do everything is not going to get anywhere. If he doesn't have special help from God, then some other guy will come up and say, no, we should do it this way, and I do it that way. But if it's a large group of people, it must be the fact that it was accepted shows that it must have been helped along by some sort of a tradition that was received from God. So Amar HaChaver Imkein HaKabbalah Anachnu V'Yakaroim Chayavim. But if that's true, if this whole argument is true, then both us and the Karaites. So now we're finally, after all this foundation, we're finally getting to the point, right? And that is both us and the Karaites require some way to understand it. The Karaites claim that they're specifically only being totally faithful 100% to the text without relying on tradition at all. But how do they know how to read it? How do they know where the verses end? How do they know exactly how to spell it? How do they know what the vowels are? Because the vowels can sometimes change the meaning of the words. And anyone, right, who recognizes that the Torah that Moshe Rabbeinu had did not have these marks in them, right? Must recognize that there is some form of tradition that's necessary to interpret it. If Moshe wrote like all Hebrew is written, and if you look back, and this is archaeologically true, you won't find from anything, with vowels, right? How did they read Hebrew? And if I see ancient Hebrew script, you never find vowels there. You never find marks for the ends of sentences. It's just not there, right? It makes it pretty hard for archaeologists sometimes to interpret things. You don't even find often space between words. If you look at a lot of ancient inscriptions, the words are jumbled together. So you really need to know where this word starts and this word ends. But so if the Torah of Moshe was written that way, how do they know? So the Karaites need something too. They also need a tradition. Amar Kuzari, Kain Omer Makaroim, right? You're right? If that's true, so then the Karaites also, Aval Achar Shematzu Torah Shlema Inim Tzrichma LaKabbalah, right? But once they have the Torah and they know how to read it, right? So they got these cantillation marks and they got the nikudot, the vowels. So now what do they need tradition for? Now they could read it, right? So Amar Chaver, the Chaver says, "V'hinei Sefer Moshe HaPashut," right? If you look at the simple sefer, the simple scroll that Moshe left us, utzrachnu b'miloso v'vadiburbo el kama kitos min hakabola min hanikud, and we need all sorts of things from tradition, all the things we talked about regarding the vowels and the cantillation marks, umi pasuk, and how to end the verses, umi mesores, and the traditions and how to spell and understand the words. Alachas kama v'kama anutzrichim be'inyanav u'perushav ki ha'enin rachav min hamilos. How much more so do we need to interpret what it means, right? The point that he's trying to make here, and this is really what he's coming down to, is like this. that in order to interpret the Torah, you have to rely on some form of tradition. In other words, the Karaites claim that they are being faithful to the text can't possibly be true, because it's impossible to be faithful to the text without relying on some form of tradition. And once you admit that you have to rely on a form of tradition in order to understand the text, so the entire argument falls apart. Because where do you draw the line? What kind of and then the Rabbi Levi goes on in putting in these words in the mouth of the Chaver, right? How much more so if you just how to pronounce the words, we need to have this a tradition to understand the meaning. So many times, even if you know the words and you know how to pronounce, you're still wondering, what does this mean, right? What does it mean? You know the word shatnez. What does it mean when it says you put on tefillin? What does that mean? How do you do it? What do you do? How do you make them, right? So you require tradition is necessary to understand the meaning. I'm sorry, I need to put this on hold for just a second. Give me a minute. I just have to. I'm sorry about that break there. I apologize. Um, but so the hatira, and I really want to finish this and think about this. Kasher amar lahem hachodesh hazel lachem rosh chodashim. This month is the first of the months. Al hadimyon, right? For example, lo nistapek ha'amim rotzolomar chodshei hamitzrim shayu beinehem, right? The people, you would imagine right away which month, right? There's lots of different calendars. The Egyptians had a calendar. We have a calendar. They have a calendar. There's lots of calendars running around the world, right? So, Chachi HaKastim, is it the Chaldean calendar, the Babylonian calendar, Shayu and Mavram Borokastim, or Ratza Chachi Shemesh, or maybe it's the solar calendar, which you and I are familiar with, right? Or Chachi Areach, or is it a lunar calendar? Or is it some hybrid in between, which, by the way, is what the Jewish calendar is, a hybrid. You know, it's a lunar calendar which adjusts to the solar calendar, and so on. So how would they have known? But the thing is, they knew. How did they know? Because obviously somebody told them, right? This is the month, right? And this is how you're going to keep months. You're going to do a lunar calendar and so on, right? And you're going to adjust it to the solar calendar so that the holidays work out the way the Torah says that, right? There must have been a tradition, like the rabbis teach us how to make our calendar so that we can fulfill the mitzvahs of the Torah. So I would love to hear the Karaites explain to me a good answer to this question and similar questions. Obviously, there was more being said that isn't written in the verse. And where was that said? Who said? How did Moshe know this is the month? How did Moshe know what kind of calendar God wanted? Well, God must have told him, right? Otherwise, yes, the Torah gives a command, but how do the Karaites know that this is the month? How do they know why don't they use the Aztec calendar or the Chinese calendar? There's lots of calendars, right? I want them to give me another answer. I'm going to ask them, right? How do you allow an animal to be eaten? We know when people are given permission to eat an animal, it's through the process of kosher slaughter, of shechita. How exactly does this slaughtering take place? Is it stabbing maybe? Or is it some other form of killing? Right? Why is it that when the way the non-Jews slaughter, why it's not kosher? Maybe they're slaughtering it the same way. Or maybe they're slaughtering it in the way that God wants. Who knows? How do we know? Right? Right? And why is it that when he slaughters, it's not kosher, but when he does the other things like skins the animal, how do we know what's the important part of preparing an animal for kosher food? And the Torah clearly says that a process needs to take place, but it doesn't tell us exactly what that process is. So there must have been some point, somebody must have said so, right? And who was that? Obviously, that was God explaining to Moshe how to fulfill what was the meaning behind the verse. I'd want to know, how are they going to explain me what chelev, which fats of the animal are prohibited? The Torah says not to eat chelev, but you're allowed to eat shuman. Now, those words in modern Hebrew are more or less interchangeable. They're both fats, right? So we know because God instructed us which fats from the animal are prohibited to eat and which fats from the animal are permissible to eat. But how do you know, right? When the Torah says this you could eat and that you can't, well, which? Well, obviously, it was explained. How do you remove the forbidden parts? Right? How let the Karaite explain to me what's permitted, what's not permitted. How does he know which parts? Right? The Torah doesn't come with a diagram that says this, with the diagram of the anatomy of a cow and explain. It doesn't come with the one. Where do we get it from? So which part, which specific animal tail is prohibited? Hayesh lageder, is it described? Where does the tail start? Where does it end? So on and so forth. So one guy might remove the whole thing, one might remove part of it. I want to know how they will explain to me. How do you know which bird is edible? The Torah doesn't give us signs. It doesn't tell us, a bird with 3 fingers or 4 fingers. It doesn't say that. It says a list a list of birds that are not kosher. How do you know what birds they are? Right? Azulas Samim, other than the ones that are well known, we all know are the ones. How do you know? Rotzalomar Ben Yona Otar, right? Because the Torah specifically refers to the pigeon, and the dove as kosher birds. But other than that, how do you know? Right? Ume'enhu omer she'ena tarnagolos v'avas v'akore v'albrechia me'atmeim. How do you know that all of these birds that people eat routinely, and he lists birds, ducks and geese, which are, chickens, whatever, that are routinely eaten, right? How do you know that those are not from the non-kosher birds? And I would want to know, when the Torah says a person shouldn't leave his place on Shabbos. What's a place? Does it mean you have to stand in the same spot and stand still for 24 hours? Does it mean your room? Does it mean your house? Does it mean your bed? Does it mean your town? How do you know? The Torah just says your place. Is it, so on and so forth. But I would want to know, the Torah says you're not allowed to do work. What's work? What kind of work are you allowed to do? Right? What work stops me from, writing and correcting in writing? Right? He's allowed to carry it around, even though it's heavy. Isn't that work? How could we carry the Torah in shul, right? And in shul, if you need to make room, we set the tables up. How is that? How do you know that that's not the kind of work that you're not allowed to do? And so on. You have a lot of guests. You need to open up the folding table, right? Right? All the kinds of things you need to do to feed your guests. It's work, right? You have to serve the food. You have to put it in big dishes. You have to get out plates. You have to wash the dishes. Is this okay? Is this not okay? The other guests are sitting and resting, and he's working hard. Certainly his servants and his wives, plural. This was days when polygamy was still prohibited, still permitted. That they're supposed to rest. So how do you make them? How do you make somebody serve food if then? What about riding the animals? Why is business? Is business work? Is making business deals work? So the bottom line is that, all of those are examples, but how do you define work? The Torah just says you're not allowed to work. How do you define it? I would ask him to be a judge in any of the arguments that happen in Mishpatim. I punched him in the face and he hurt his eye. How much do I owe him? I broke his arm. I stole this. He told me to watch this. If you look through it carefully, there's a lot of question marks. How exactly do I judge a real case? Right? Right? Obviously, they had a tradition on how to interpret those verses. Without going into each one in detail, it's impossible to to do justice based on specifically only what's written. And then I want to know, what about the laws of inheritance? How do we do mila? How do we do circumcision? The Torah doesn't describe the procedure of circumcision, what needs to be removed, how much needs to be removed. We have no idea. The Torah just says to do it. So how do we know how to do it? Or tzitzis and sukkah, all of these things. The Torah says sit in a sukkah. Does it tell you how to build it, how you make it, what do you make it out of, what you don't make it out of? It doesn't say anything like that. What about the Karaites agree that that they pray. Where does it say in the Torah that we're supposed to pray? What about, how do we know that there's a place in the future where all the souls gather, that there's a world to come, that there's schar v'onesh, that there's ultimate justice? What about when two mitzvahs conflict with each other, such as a circumcision falls out on the Sabbath, or Pesach falls out on the Sabbath? How do they know which one is more important? The Torah doesn't give us guidance, and not the written Torah. So there's many examples. It goes on, where it's clearly obvious that the Torah left out so much context that it's impossible to keep the Torah without understanding that there must be a form of tradition that was given along with the Torah in order to understand it. So he laid out a pretty, we can quibble here and there with some of his points, and I was gonna do it a few times, but it doesn't matter. The overwhelming argument is solid, and that is that obviously anyone that reads the Torah and claims that we're supposed to keep the Torah, if you want to ignore the Torah, that's a different story. But if you don't want to ignore it and you want to keep the Torah, if you just read the verses, you're going to be left with a lot missing. Have you heard of some sort of a book from the Karaites that describes their answers to all this and how they do it? Do they have some sort of a tradition of their own? Do they have they never argue with each other? Regarding laws or how to spell words, how to interpret words. So I'm gonna read the 36. I just turned to page 330, and I'm gonna say the Chazar King says lower Isivil Shamati. I don't really know that much about the Karaites, but I can tell from that which I'd meet them, I see that they're trying their hardest to stick to the meaning of the words themselves. So the argument that the Chaver made was pretty solid. And that's his main argument with the Karaites. It's clearly obvious that the Torah requires interpretation, and that the most logical form of interpretation is that when Moshe was told, he was told this, and this is how you read it, this is how you interpret it, and that was passed from one generation, a public, all the people that heard it at Sinai taught it to their children, and taught it to their children, taught it to their children, and that tradition stays alive throughout. There's going to be more to talk about next week on this topic as we go through this very important issue. I didn't leave a lot of opening for questions, so let me open up the floor now in case someone wants to say something.
Yeah, let me ask a question about the oral law and its application to interpretation of the written law,
Right.
and how much is there and how much is left out in terms of other interpretations in relation to the Karaites. What do they think about the oral law, and how do they incorporate it?
Well, I don't know a lot about the Karaites, but from what I know, they don't believe that there's such a thing as like we have as an oral law. That's the primary difference. They don't think there's an oral law. And I honestly don't know how they decide what the proper interpretations are. I don't know. But they try to stick to the. My guess is that they have their own. They developed over the years probably their own traditions on how they interpret things.
Yeah.
So which is,
I forgot to take my dinner pill.
Yeah, so it's that would be that would be my guess, but I don't know enough about the Karaites. When it comes to us and our belief in the oral law, that's obviously a big subject, right? But the bottom line is that a rabbinite, right? When you talk about Karaites versus rabbinites, that's how you would refer to us versus them, assuming that you're a rabbinite like I am, right? but I mean, nowadays it became mainstream Judaism. But in the days when there was a lot of both groups, it would have been the rabbinites versus the Karaites. Anyway, those that believe in tradition believe that from the beginning the Torah was taught together with its interpretations. Now, over time, still differences developed, arguments developed, and that how arguments developed is a very important but very detailed subject, which I have wait, no, it's not really the forum for right now. Maybe we can mention it a little more as we go through, but bottom line, throughout history, different traditions, different ways of understanding traditions developed, but clearly certain things and how we interpret the Torah are consistent. And that's what Judaism is based on. It's based on that these traditions go all the way back, that we learned from our parents and our teachers from previous generations, who learned from the generations that preceded them, exactly what God means when he says you're supposed to shecht an animal, right? When you're supposed to slaughter an animal, right? And that's part and parcel of modern Judaism. I mean, that these traditions have been passed down, and that's a very important aspect of rabbinic Judaism. So yeah, I don't know if I didn't answer your question about the Karaites, because honestly, I'm not an authority on that. You can
Yeah, I mean, what do they think? Do you know what they think of the Talmud and
well,
Mishnah?
the Talmud itself is totally not for them.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
They
They don't do
reject the
any of
whole
it.
thing.
They
That's
don't do
totally
any of it. They
no.
don't do any of
Now,
that.
if you want to know more, go to there's websites that they have. There are some Karaites left. There's not many, but
Yeah.
they do exist. Go to karaitejudaism.org or whatever, and I'm sure you can email somebody, and he or she will probably be able to answer your questions.
Yeah.
There's a Karaite synagogue in the Jewish quarter of Jerusalem, uh, and the few people that are there, I'd be happy to talk to you if you ever go. You can hang in there. I mean, they're nice. I hung out there. They're nice enough people. They don't feel too fondly about rabbinic Judaism, but as people, they seem nice enough, and they showed
But
me
they'll talk to you. They'll talk to you.
what.
But they'll talk to you.
Yeah, they'll talk to you and they'll tell you what their belief system is. Um, but it's very different from ours. But it's that's what they believe Judaism is. But all right. If tonight might it's just, it was interesting from a different perspective than some of the other nights. But thank you so much for joining, and I really appreciate everyone who came.
It was very enjoyable.
Yes, thank
Yeah,
you,
thank you, so.
and I hope that Mirza Hashem, next week we'll be together again. We'll keep rolling. We still have a little bit more of Karaism to discuss.
Okay.
All right.
Thanks.
All right, take care. Have a wonderful night. Thanks. Bye bye.
Thank you.